Hello, History 2 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 20, Section 1. And we're going to get into talking about some other movements of the 1960s and 70s. And we're going to focus on students and the counterculture. And to kind of lead into this, you kind of have to know a little bit about this period of time. We had a rise in different youth movements, kind of starting back into the 1950s. And one of the things that I think is interesting is we had a group of individuals who were probably most likely World War II era young people, veterans perhaps, that were demonstrating against things like poverty, pushing for civil rights reform, speaking out about some of the problems with warfare. And this movement became known as the Beat Movement in the 1950s. For the most part, they openly criticized American society. They believed that American society valued conformity over independence. They valued maybe financial gain over what the Beats would have wanted with spiritual and social advancement. So in a way, our hippies have already got the roots already started. And as the movement for a lot of our youth in the 1960s starts growing, they look upon the people who are part of the beat culture, who were literally the generation before them. So, number two, what group of people originated the youth movement of the 1960s? And the people that we're going to talk about are the baby boomers. Just to kind of put things into perspective, when we talk about our baby boomers kind of reaching adulthood, roughly 1970, a little short than 60% of our overall U.S. population was under the age of 34, compared to 2000, where only about 49% of our population was under the age of 34. So we had a huge crop of young people. And as a result, a lot of them were going to college. Matter of fact, between 1960 and 1966, college enrollment, particularly four-year colleges and universities, went from roughly 3.1 million students in 1960 up to about 5 million students by 1966, kind of during the years of the Vietnam War. So, where did our youth protest movements begin in the 1960s? Well, college, of course, because we have lots of people there. College campuses, for the most part, didn't matter if you were talking about major Big Ten universities or if you were talking about small state colleges. All of them were busting at the seams with all these young people. And we're going to have different movements that are going to come up. We're going to talk first of all about a movement known as SDS, and then eventually about the free speech movement. So what group urged citizens to stop accepting a country run by big corporations and big government? And that was a group known as SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, which sometimes called themselves the New Left, because they were concerned about injustices over our country's political and social systems. In other words, they were concerned about how maybe the wealthy elite were kind of controlling politics and the fact that maybe wealth wasn't equally distributed. This differs from a group that we would call the Old Left, which goes kind of back to the 1930s and maybe even 1920s. These were people who were pro-communism, pro-socialism. Today, some people might even say groups like SDS probably dabbled a little bit with some of those ideas. But SDS was actually formed in 1959 at the University of Michigan. And in 1962, a guy named Tom Hayden, who you see pictured below here, issues what is called the Port Huron Statement, which basically called for an end for young people to stop being apathetic. It urged them to stop accepting this country being run by the big corporations and big government. By the time we get to kind of the middle of the 1960s, as we enter into the Vietnam War, SDS is going to be very vocal in protesting the war itself. And in 1968, they did an 8-day occupation of the university, or Columbia University, which is in New York, part of the Ivy League, because Columbia University was planning to build a recreation center or gym over on a property that was part of a neighborhood park. Another movement was known as the free speech movement. And so what issue sparked the free speech movement at Berkeley? Berkeley would be University of California at Berkeley. And that had to do with an event that happened in 1964 when the university was concerned that there were a lot of demonstrations going on throughout the country, and they wanted to restrict students' rights from distributing literature and recruiting volunteers for political causes, particularly for the Democratic Party. And on December 2nd, 1964, members of this free speech movement at Berkeley staged a sit-in. And they had a lot of speeches, and one of the guys who was kind of the leaders of these speeches was a guy named Mario Savio. As this goes on the 2nd of December 1964, police move in and they arrest roughly about 700 protesters. Within the days to come, what's going to happen is that there's going to be a campus-wide strike. And matter of fact, professors who kind of were ignoring some of this protesting on the campus actually started supporting the students. And eventually, this whole situation about the free speech movement at Berkeley is going to go all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States, where the court actually upheld the students' right to free speech and a peaceful assembly on campus. So how did this Berkeley revolt become a model for student protest? They were using tactics of abandoning classes, they were occupying buildings, and what they found is that these were very effective, and as a result, they get adopted throughout the United States, even in places like Nebraska. Number 7, what was the name for a group living arrangement found in hippie counterculture? And that was known as the commune. Just to kind of lead you in, when we talk about our beat culture of the 1950s, our hippies are kind of like the counterculture of the 1960s and 70s. Many of them kind of lived a lifestyle that was supposedly kind of focused in on how they dressed, wearing kind of tattered clothes, maybe even ethnic clothing. Communal living was part of that. In some cases, even drug use. So certainly a lot of our hippies rejected rationality and order and traditional middle class values. So what factors contributed to the decline of this counterculture movement? And some of that was the fact that a lot of these urban areas where hippies were congregating actually became very dangerous places to live. A great example of this would be the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco, which at the beginning of this whole hippie movement, kind of starting in the early mid-1960s, it just happened to be just a kind of a unique neighborhood in San Francisco. As the 60s roll on, and we start getting into the music scene a little bit, more and more people start moving here. And eventually by about 1968, 1969, this is an area where you're going to start seeing muggings and drug overdoses and other types of criminal activities. So certainly it wasn't all glamorous, let's just put it that way. Plus the glamour of drug use had kind of waned a little bit, and our hippies are getting older. They're getting married, they're having children, and they're taking on responsibilities. And as a result, they kind of moved on. So, number 9, how was fashion used to express the values of the counterculture? And some of that was the fact that a lot of our young people are wearing very inexpensive, recycled clothing, for the most part, like going to secondhand stores. The idea is that they were rejecting commercialism. They were rejecting social classes. Ethnic clothing became very popular. Matter of fact, clothing with a lot of fringes and beads kind of was a throwback to Native Americans, and the tie-dye was kind of a throwback to the culture of South Asia, like in India. So for the most part, it was a time where these people were adapting a lot of different ideas. Number 10, how did the folk music and rock and roll music of the 1960s express the mood of the counterculture? And a lot of this was the fact that these musicians expressed hopes and fears for the people of their generation. Where did thousands of people gather in 1969 to hear music together? Well, probably more famous is Woodstock, New York, where a very big gathering of almost 1 million people occurred in August of 1969. Woodstock was supposed to be kind of a 3-day cultural concert kind of event, craft fair, if you want to call it that, on top of it. And people who were going to go there were going to pay to participate. Well, at some point in time, there's so many people that they storm the gates and it becomes a free concert. And actually, the whole area surrounding this region actually becomes like a disaster zone because people are abandoning cars because there's just so much traffic. It rains and literally these people are caught in the mud. It's really kind of a mess, but yet it's a lot of peace and love and harmony. Compared to that of Altamont in California, this was California's, or was supposed to be California's version of Woodstock. And it actually becomes kind of like the opposite of Woodstock. Woodstock was all about peace, love, and harmony, and Altamont was all about violence. This concert was held near a racetrack near San Francisco. Matter of fact, they had planned to have it near Golden Gate Park, and they couldn't get the permits for it. And it was going to be headlined by the Rolling Stones. And what ends up happening is the concert gets closer. They're having a hard time finding people to be security to make sure that we don't have a free concert like we had at Woodstock. And they hired the Hells Angels to provide security. And so the concert begins. And if you've ever been to a concert, a lot of times people kind of push towards the stage. And what ends up happening is our Hells Angels, they get a little freaked out and they start beating up on a lot of the concert goers. And matter of fact, before the Rolling Stones perform, there is a situation where a Hells Angel kills a fan in the audience because of that. So it's really kind of a eerie postscript of the peace, love, and harmony generation. Number 12, how is music today influenced by musicians like Jimi Hendrix? Well, Hendrix, who was at Woodstock, he used a lot of electrical amplified instruments, particularly his guitar, and it really changed the sound of rock and roll music. Thank you very much.